we will begin our series on Daniel with chapter 7. And I'd first like to look at how it fits within the book as a whole. The book of Daniel could perhaps be divided into two parts, each with a parallel chiastic structure. So I would suggest that this is the sort of structure of the book. So we have chapter 2 to chapter 7 is the first half, and then chapter 7 to chapter 12 makes up the second half, and there's also a sort of a mirroring theme which goes between them. So chapter 2 mirrors chapter 7. They both speak of the dreams of the four kingdoms, and both end with the everlasting kingdom. Chapter 3 and chapter 6 are linked, each showing God's servants put to the test. So that's Daniel's three friends in the thrown into the fire, and Daniel into the lion's den, and they're both saved from peril by God's angel. And likewise chapters 4 and 5, which are examples of the pride of Babylon's kings and demonstrations that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men. And there is, I think, a similar structure, perhaps linking chapter 7 with chapter 12, both of them speaking of end-time judgment. Chapter 8 with chapter 11, which are both talking about the king of Grecia, whose kingdom is split into four, and also include a latter-day destroying king who comes to his end. And chapters 9 and 10, which both speak of Christ, in chapter 9 as the Messiah cut off, and in chapter 10 as the multitudinous Christ. And so if we take this structure, then this chapter 7 is linked to chapters 2 and chapter 12, each of them containing the hope of God's everlasting kingdom being established. So you have that in the end of Daniel 2. And in the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. The kingdom shall not be left to other people. It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. And then in Daniel 7, verse 27, the kingdom and dominion and the greatness of the heaven under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High, whose kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey him. And also in Daniel 12, verse 3, where we have the wise shining as the brightness of the firmament, and they that turn many to righteousness as the stars, forever and ever. And so chapter 7 is at the centre of these and bridges the two halves of the book of Daniel. So the first half is chronological and records encounters that Daniel had with the kings he encountered in Babylon. And the second half is a series of visions which Daniel received with their interpretations. The second half is written in Hebrew, in contrast to the first half, and concerns things revealed only to Daniel, which are written down, but aren't interpreted for the king, as far as the record indicates. As chapter 7 is sitting in the middle, it contains aspects of each of these two halves, which matches how it fits in the structure. It fits in the first half in that it's written in the third person, not as though Daniel is the writer. So, as in the end of chapter 6, you can see it's talking about Daniel in the third person. This Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius. And that continues in chapter 7, verse 1, that Daniel had a dream and visions of his head upon his bed. Not as though Daniel is the writer. Much of Daniel 7 is a record of Daniel's speech recounting his vision, which begins in in verse 2, where Daniel spake and said. And this changes, though, in chapter 8, which is where sort of the second half of the book sort of properly starts, in that it's now in the third year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared unto me, even unto me, Daniel. And from chapter 8, verse 1, the rest of Daniel is all written in Hebrew. While most of chapters 2 to 7 are written in Chaldee or Aramaic. It's different from the first half in certain respects too, though. It's the first chapter which does not follow in the chronological order. It's written in the first year of Belshazzar, who should be long dead if it were chronological, because it comes after chapter 6 with Darius the Median. Rather, this vision likely fits between chapters 4 and 5 in the chronological sort of half, after Nebuchadnezzar, but before the end of Belshazzar's reign. And apart from suiting the chronology of the second half, it is also the first vision given to Daniel rather than a king, with the exception of a vision in Daniel 2. We don't appear to be told to whom Daniel spake the vision, perhaps to his fellow Jewish captives in Babylon. And so chapter 7 seems to be then a bridge between the two halves of the book, perhaps emphasizing the connection it has with chapter 2, which is important for its interpretation. And this is just showing that if the chapters were in chronological order, it would be something like that, and chapter 7 would come earlier after chapter 4. So having looked at the position of the chapter in the book, we will now look at the structure of chapter 7 itself. As we've seen, it's a speech introduced in verse 1, and Daniel begins by describing the vision of the four beasts, followed by the kingdom of one like the Son of Man, which goes from verse 2 to verse 14, is all that description of the vision. In brief summary, he sees the lion, the bear, then the leopard, then the dreadful fourth beast. He then sees the Ancient of Days sit and the dreadful beast slain, after which the Son of Man is given everlasting dominion. So I'd suggest section 1 is verses 2 to 14. Then Daniel seeks an interpretation in verse 15 and 16. And a very short interpretation is given in verses 17 and 18. But Daniel's curiosity is not quenched with this, and he seeks to understand the dreadful fourth beast in verses 19 to 22, and he specifies particular aspects he wants to understand, and including some of them which are details which aren't given in his first account of the vision. For example, the nails of brass in verse 19. This is similar to Nebuchadnezzar's dream in chapter 2, where no mention of miry clay or toes is made when the dream is first described, but in the interpretation, these details are given. So, in verses 19 to 22 of Daniel 7, we have new details about the fourth beast. His nails were of brass, the little horn's look was more stout than his fellows, and the little horn made war with the saints. And then the last section runs from verses 23 to the end, in which these aspects of the fourth beast are interpreted. The chapter then isn't just a simple structure of vision, then interpretation. There's a vision, a short interpretation, there's further questions, and then a second interpretation concerning the fourth beast. So I'd like us now to go through the vision piece by piece and see what details we are given about each aspect and how these might be interpreted with respect to Scripture and history. So if we begin then in verse 2, Daniel spake and said, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of the heaven strove upon the great sea. So it's the four winds of heaven, which is a phrase that comes up in Jeremiah 49. In Jeremiah 49, verse 36, talking about judgments on Elam, it says, And upon Elam will I bring the four winds from the four quarters of heaven, and will scatter them toward all those winds. And there shall no nation whither the outcasts of Elam, and there shall be no nation whither the outcasts of Elam shall not come. And so there Elam is scattered to the four winds, and it's that no nation whither there will be no nation whither they shall not come. Meaning that this idea of the four winds suggests great unrest among many nations. And so this vision is about the whole kingdom of men. And we note also in Daniel 7 verse 2 that it is the great sea that is the scene of the vision. And this makes us think of the Mediterranean, as in Joshua 1, where the land is described, and the Great Sea there refers to the Mediterranean. And we also know from Revelation 17 that this symbol of waters can be interpreted as peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues. We have then the arena of the nations, perhaps focused around the Mediterranean. And what Daniel is going to learn about is the roaring of the kingdom of man in this arena. If we carry on then to verse 3, "And 4 great beasts came up from the sea, diverse one from another." And so we see here the symbol of the great beasts. And it's an apt sort of description that God uses for the kingdoms of men here, of the beast representing the kingdoms. In Psalm 49 and verse 20, we read, "Man that is in honour and understandeth not is like the beasts that perish." And here we have 4 great beasts which arise out of this great sea. This language is very similar to Psalm 104. So Psalm 104, which is a psalm that extols God's creative power. And in Psalm 104, verse 24, it speaks about how God has filled the sea. Psalm 104, verse 24, "O Yahweh, how manifold are thy works! In wisdom hast thou made them all. The earth is full of thy riches. So is this great and wide sea, wherein are things creeping, innumerable, both small and great beasts. There go the ships. There is that Leviathan, whom thou hast made to play therein." And so it speaks of how God has filled the sea, including making great beasts like the Leviathan, but they're all formed by God. And it's a reminder that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men, and even a great beast or a great king can be controlled by God. And so if we go back to Daniel chapter 7, we have the interpretation given of these 4 great beasts in verse 17 of the chapter. That these great beasts, which are 4 kings which shall arise out of the earth. And so these are 4 kings or kingdoms which will arise out of the earth. Let's go to the first one then, which is in verse 4. "The first was like a lion, and had eagle's wings. I beheld till the wings thereof were plucked, and it was lifted up from the earth, and made stand upon the feet as a man, and a man's heart was given to it." So the first beast is like a lion. And if you come to Jeremiah chapter 50 and verse 17, here we have great nations of the time described as lions. So Jeremiah 50 verse 17, "Israel is a scattered sheep. The lions have driven him away. First the king of Assyria hath devoured him, and last this Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, hath broken his bones." And so there are 2 devouring lion powers here then, Assyria and Babylon. And I've put on the screen the reference in Judges to Samson when the Philistines gave the answer to the riddle, "What is stronger than a lion?" And so we see the strength of the Assyro-Babylonian Empire then in this first great beast which arises. And there's a picture of a lion found on the processional way from the Ishtar Gate into the city of Babylon that's been found in archaeology. The Ishtar Gate was constructed around 575 BC by King Nebuchadnezzar II of Babylon, made of fired bricks and decorated with animals made in glazed bricks. And so we have here the kingdom of Babylon associated with the lion. And then, if we focus then on the latter half of this verse, I think there's some interesting connections with Daniel chapter 4 here, when Nebuchadnezzar was driven from men. So if we have a look at Daniel 4 and verse 16. Speaking of Nebuchadnezzar, it says, "Let his heart be changed from man's, and let a beast's heart be given unto him, and let 7 times pass over him." And so his heart is changed from a man's heart to a beast's heart. This is the opposite to what we have in Daniel 7, where a man's heart is given to this beast like a lion. And then if we look further in Daniel 4 and verse 33, it describes Nebuchadnezzar as having hairs grown like eagle's feathers and nails like birds' claws. And so perhaps what we have in chapter 7 then is a reversal of this fall to the level of beasts. Rather than hair grown like eagle's feathers, Babylon's wings are plucked and it is lifted from the earth. Rather than eating grass as oxen, Babylon is made to stand upon the feet as a man. And rather than a beast's heart, a man's heart is given to it. And so maybe in this representation of the kingdom of men, represented by beasts, this time that we read of in Daniel 4, where Nebuchadnezzar said in verse 37, "Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honour the King of heaven, all whose works are truth and his way is judgment, and those that walk in pride he is able to abase." Maybe this was a time when the king over the kingdom of men, Nebuchadnezzar, had understanding of the things of God and stood apart from the beasts of the rest of its history. We'll go on now to the second beast in verse 5 of Daniel 7. "And behold, another beast, a second, like to a bear, and it raised up itself on one side. It had 3 ribs in the mouth of it, between the teeth of it. And they said thus unto it, Arise, devour much flesh." And the symbol of the bear is less common in Scripture than the lion. But you may remember when at the time of Elisha, 2 she-bears came forth out of the wood and tare 42 children. So we have it again as another symbol of a violent beast that's being portrayed. And it raised up itself on one side. If you go to Daniel 5, verse 31, the end of Daniel 5, when this second kingdom takes power, it says, Daniel 5, verse 31, "And Darius the Median took the kingdom, being about 62 years old." And then again in Daniel 6, verse 8, talking about the law there, it says, "The law of the Medes and Persians, which altereth not." And so it seems that the Medes and the Persians, it seems that the Medes and the Persians were at sort of a level pegging, or perhaps the Medes had the ascendancy at this stage. But then if we turn back to Esther chapter 1, so Esther chapter 1, which is in the future compared to Daniel's time, we see that there's a change. It's no longer the law of the Medes and the Persians. So in verse 19, it says, "If it please the king, let there go a royal commandment from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes." And so the Persians here have the ascendancy. They have been raised up and are the primary force in the empire, which is the meaning of this being raised up on one side, that the Persians became dominant. And the bear, back in Daniel 7, had in its mouth 3 ribs. And the word for ribs there, in Ezekiel 41, the Hebrew equivalent is translated as side chamber. And so I'd suggest possibly we have parts or regions of the empire being described. And there may be an indication of this in Daniel chapter 6. In Daniel 6, verse 2, again at the start of this Medo-Persian Empire, over the 120 princes, Darius set 3 presidents, of whom Daniel was first. And so perhaps there was sort of three parts to this Medo-Persian Empire. And if we carry on then to verse 6 of Daniel 7, we get the third beast. After this I beheld, and lo, another like a leopard, which had upon the back of it 4 wings of a fowl. The beast had also 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. The third beast is like a leopard, and I'll just quickly go to Jeremiah chapter 5, where it says, "Wherefore a lion out of the forest shall slay them, and a wolf of the evening shall spoil them. A leopard shall watch over their cities. Every one that goeth out thence shall be torn in pieces, because their transgressions are many." And so there the leopard is waiting outside and tearing them in pieces. So again we have a violent beast describing this kingdom. And it's said to have 4 wings of a fowl. And so you have the idea of flying in the heaven as a fowl, and the leopard, of course, being a fast beast. It speaks of the great speed of Alexander the Great's conquest of the world. And in verse 6, it talks about the 4 heads. And in Genesis 2, verse 10, there's the river that runs through the garden, and it says that parted into 4 heads. And I think that's a similar idea with what we have with the 4 heads of the third beast. The kingdom was divided into 4. And the meaning of the symbol of the head we get in Revelation chapter 17. In the description of another beast. So, Revelation 17, in verse 3, where this other beast is described, a scarlet-coloured beast full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. And the interpretation is given in verse 9. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sitteth, and there are 7 kings. 5 are fallen, and 1 is, and the other is not yet come. And so there the heads refer to 7 kings. And so this matches what we find in history with the kingdom of Greece. The Persians were defeated by Alexander the Great, who swept over the territory on the screen, conquering very quickly. He died at a young age, though, and the empire was split. It parted into 4, which was given to 4 generals who became rulers of these 4 territories. And so that's the third beast. We'll move then on to the 4th beast. It's described in verse 7 as a dreadful and terrible 4th beast, strong exceedingly. And this idea of it being terrible comes up in chapter 2, where in verse 31, Daniel describes the image which King Nebuchadnezzar saw as a great image. This great image, whose brightness was excellent, stood before thee, and the form thereof was terrible, or fearful. And so it's described as a terrible beast, a source of fear to all those who faced it. And it was exceeding strong, like the iron in chapter 2 again. So in chapter 2, verse 40, the 4th kingdom shall be strong as iron, forasmuch as iron breaketh in pieces and subdueth all things. And as iron that breaketh all these shall it break in pieces and bruise. And also, again, it has great iron teeth, linking to this subduing strength of the iron in chapter 2. And so this represents the great strength of Rome, which conquered the world after the Greeks. And if we carry on in verse 7 of Daniel 7, it had great iron teeth, it devoured and brake in pieces, and stamped the residue with the feet of it. And it was diverse from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. And these 10 horns, what do they represent? Well, we have an interpretation given in verse 24. The 10 horns out of this kingdom are 10 kings that shall arise. This represents the breaking up of the Roman Empire. So barbarian tribes of around 400 to 600 AD overran the empire, but they were inheritors and not only destroyers. And so these 10 tribes, although it went over a significant period of time, it may be sort of an average symbolic number, but these are 10 kings which took over the land of the Roman Empire, and they are represented with these 10 horns, and they're also present at the time of Christ's return to oppose him. Again, in Revelation chapter 17, we saw that beast had 7 heads and 10 horns. And again in verse 12, the 10 horns which thou sawest are 10 kings, which have received no kingdom as yet, but receive power as kings 1 hour with the beast. We'll carry on then to verse 8 of Daniel chapter 7. I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another little horn, before whom there were 3 of the first horns plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of man, and a mouth speaking great things. This little horn is diverse from all before it, and it subdues 3 kings. And in history we find that this is the political power of the papacy rising from Rome. And the Pope was given states or territories within this area of the 10 kings, making it a strange or diverse king. And then in verse 21, we get more detail about this horn. I beheld, and the same horn made war with the saints and prevailed against them. And we get the interpretation of that in verse 25. That he shall speak great words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High. And so this power made war with the saints. It persecuted God's people. And we see this in the Acts of the Papacy, who propounded the duty to persecute and exterminate heretics with fire and sword. Another detail we have about this little horn is in verse 20, that it had a mouth that spake very great things. And again in verse 25 we have the interpretation. And he shall speak great words against the Most High. And so this is a religious power, but it's against God. Excommunicating kings, absolving men of their allegiance to their kings or governments. And we have also in verse 20 that whose look was more stout than his fellows. And perhaps this is to do with him thinking to change times and laws. And we have the instituting of new articles of faith, papal infallibility, and changes to the calendar under the papacy. And just an extra bit of interpretation at the end of that verse 25. And they shall be given into his hand until a time and times and the dividing of time. So this is the saints being given into the hands of this power for a time, times, and dividing of time. And so if a time is the Hebrew year of 360 days, and times is 2 of those, that's 720. And a dividing of time is half of that. And you add all that together, you get 1,260 days And if we take the day for a year principle, we have a persecution for 1,260 years. And there are sort of various suggestions as to what that time period could refer to. One perhaps being a decree of focus in 606 AD to 1866, when the temporal power of the Pope was broken, and the city of Rome was captured from the Pope on 20th of September 1870. Rome and what was left of the Papal States were annexed to the Kingdom of Italy, and as a result of a plebiscite the following October. This marked the definite end of the Papal States. So we've looked then at these four beasts and how they've appeared in history. But if we continue now on to verse 9, which it's almost like there's a jump forward in time here, where Daniel says, "I beheld till the thrones were cast down, and the Ancient of Days did sit, whose garment was white as snow, and the hair of his head like the pure wool." And this idea of the garment being white as snow comes in Isaiah chapter 1. So Isaiah chapter 1, verse 18. "Come now, and let us reason together, saith Yahweh. Though your sins be as scarlet, they shall be as white as snow. Though they be red like crimson, they shall be as wool." And so this idea of the garment being white as snow and the hair of his head like pure wool suggests a sinlessness of this Ancient of Days that sits in his throne. And slide behind. And we also have his throne described. His throne was like the fiery flame, and his wheels as burning fire. So in Daniel 3, verse 22, we have an example of sort of a king's flaming fire. "Therefore, because the king's commandment was urgent, and the furnace exceeding hot, the flame of the fire slew those men that took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego." And so this idea of a fiery flame is of judgment and of destruction. And we see that coming through in the beast being slain in verse 11, and his body destroyed and given to the burning flame. And then in verse 10, "A fiery stream issued and came forth from before him. Thousands ministered unto him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The judgment was set, and the books were opened." And so we have this fiery stream, a river of judgment before the river of water that will have eventually spring forth from Jerusalem. Before the time of peace, there's a time of judgment. And this judgment is represented in this fiery stream and fiery flame. And it says that the books were opened. I've just put a reference there to Ezra chapter 4. Where there's sort of an idea of this book of records. So Ezra 4 verse 15. This is referring to the records, I think, of the kings of Persia. But it says, "That search may be made in the book of the records of thy fathers. So shalt thou find in the book of the records, and know that this city is a rebellious city, and hurtful unto kings and provinces, and that they have moved sedition within the same of old time, for which cause was this city destroyed." But you have this idea of books being opened, of past behaviours being brought to light, and judgment being made. And so there's this time of judgment, which, as we say in verse 11, comes upon this great beast. I beheld then, because of the voice of the great words which the horn spoke, I beheld even till the beast was slain, and his body destroyed, and given to the burning flame. As concerning the rest of the beast, they had their dominion taken away. And so there's a judgment here on this kingdom of men. But there's also judgment on the saints, because what we see at the end of the vision is in verse 13. I saw in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man came with the clouds of heaven, and came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. And there was given him dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all people, nations, and languages should serve him. And there's this one like the Son of Man. It says that his dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, his kingdom that which shall not be destroyed. And this brings our minds back to the promises in 2 Samuel chapter 7, where God says to David, when thy days be fulfilled, when thou shalt sleep with thy fathers, I will set up thy seed after thee, which shall proceed out of thy bowels, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build an house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. And so we see this Son of Man being set on his throne. And it says that he came with the clouds of heaven. And so I'd like us to go to Hebrews chapter 12. So in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 1, this is after Hebrews 11, detailing the faithful saints through the ages. Wherefore, seeing we also are compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which doth so easily beset us, and let us run with patience the race that is set before us. And so what we have then here at the end of the vision in Daniel 7, we have the Ancient of Days and the judgment on the nations. But we also have the setting up of an everlasting kingdom under Christ. And so we look to that time and need to make ourselves ready. And so what can we take away from our study of Daniel 7? It's a detailed and powerful reminder of the power that God wields over the nations. We've seen how God described to Daniel the plans that he had for the nations that were to arise and how they have occurred. And this gives us confidence that the ultimate purpose of our God will likewise surely come to pass. Man's inability to control events is evident, but God's word is sure.